Minulam Makwait, welcome everybody to Learning with Syeyutsus. This project is a Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools project, and this year in conjunction with our friends at UBC Press and the Vancouver Island Regional Library. So if you're in a library today on Vancouver Island, welcome. My name's Ted Cadwallader. My two co-hosts, Swital Tantanat and Tsongkwatan, Stephanie Johnson, Lawrence Mitchell. And as always on this territory, or Hokkaido is the language. I turn it over to our relative Tsongkwatan to welcome us all.
Well, Squale Muck Wait. Heights Apsa Quasi Yellow What Enomet at Tanak Whale. Eats up Athamet at the CM Aqua at Tanak Whale. Isabel or Isabel? Sorry.
Isabel.
Okay, Heichka.
Nice meeting you.
Iwi at Skop the Tanak Whale Heights Apka. Cats Main Height Height to high all eight squale at an quail. Heichka neat hully. Heichka to high all I met tamo at an quail. Eat muck squale. Eat we at an quakikalis e cocky mustimo. E wham slathakan stoch than at whelmo. E wham slachant the mustimo sanu at cocky out. Heichka quits what eat at an atamach and the quail eat muck squale. E wham slachant the thema size at an quail. Heichka to high light squale Heichka. Oh, 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 hey. Oh, 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 hey. Whoa, whoa, oh, hey. Whoa, whoa, 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 hey. High, oh, I sway, oh. High, high, oh, I sway, oh. High, the High sky, whoa, whoa, hey. Whoa, whoa, hey. Whoa, whoa, Zapka, Makswait, Zapka.
Thank you to you both. I'm going to assume that you were not driving at that time. No, okay. We'll stay safe always. Thanks so much, Lawrence, and to Kira too for that welcome and that song. I always appreciate it when we can start off in a really good way that the ancestors of this territory would recognize. Right? It's our pleasure today on behalf of Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools, Vancouver Island Regional Libraries, and UBC Press to welcome our guest of honor, Dr. Isabel Altamirano-Jiménez. She is the Canada Research Chair in Comparative Indigenous Feminist Studies, Associate Professor at the University of Alberta in both the Department of Political Science and Faculty of Native Studies. She is a Zapotec woman from TehuantepecIsthmus in Mexico, and we are so pleased to welcome her here to talk about her book, Living on the Land, Indigenous Women's Understanding of Place. This book, it was such a treasure to read because it reminded me of all of the aunties and cousins and grandmas who have looked after us and guided us along our journeys, wherever we come from. And a little bit about how they have not been held up in recent times and how we're trying to reclaim that space and revitalize it. So welcome, Dr. Isabel.
Padyuja, Chushkija, Stephanie Johnson, Ted Cadwallader, and Lawrence, Nechushkija Bininisedo, Salish. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie Johnson, Ted Cadwallader, and Lawrence for inviting me to be here and for the beautiful song to start us today, Lawrence. And thank you to the Coast Salish people for allowing me to be a guest today. I'm speaking from Treaty 6 territory, from Misquasis, Waskahikan. I acknowledge that this is not my land. I am Biniza from the Tehuantepec-Isthmus, Mexico, and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is located between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. It is a plateau covered by rivers, sea coasts, and marine lagoons. It is 220 kilometers wide in its narrowest part. The northern slopes are home to tropical forests, high in and rich in biodiversity. This is a zone when the flora and fauna of North and South America converge. The southern slopes are hot and dry and contain some of the largest lagoon systems in Mexico. The isthmus manifests itself in a complex world composed of different entities such as water, land, or wind. Wind is considered a dual entity. The north wind, or Tehuano, is considered male and is characterized by a continental, cold, dry wind that comes from the Arctic. The south wind, in contrast, is female, gentle, warm, and damp. Wind and water shapes the condition of the land, producing atmospheric conditions shaping our ceremonial cycles and livelihood. Our stories, like most Indigenous stories, talk about the living beings within our specific homeland. They explain why and how certain entities, local plants, or animals come to be. Our stories explain why we hold ceremonies and rituals for rain and water. My ancestors were the Binigulasa. Zapotec, or Dijaza, my indigenous language, is a tonal language, so accents change the meaning of words. The story of the Binigulasa then can be told in three different ways. If I say Binigulasa, the story tells about a people that decided to disperse after having a conflict or a communal celebration. If I say Binigulasa, I'm telling the story of a people that was born from the roots of the trees. But if I say the Binigulaza, I'm saying that my people were born from the clouds, or a manifestation of water. And this is often the story that is told. It speaks of how my ancestors were born from the beautiful birds of colorful feathers that one day descended from the clouds. Some became humans, other fish, other plants, mountains, and so on. So as Zapotecs, we see ourselves as being related to the non-human beings, to clouds, to birds, trees, the ocean, and the wind. We think that things perceived by others as inanimate, such as mountains or wind, have genda, or essence of life. We call knowledge genda nabiani, literally meaning the essence of life and light. Zapotec knowledge is not rigid, is subject to interpretation, and as individuals, we can interpret and theorize this knowledge within a communal horizon of laws, values, and principles. I am telling you all of this to show that knowledge has ancestors, and it comes from specific places. I acknowledge that my ancestors are from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And I think that this acknowledgement involves some responsibilities now that I live and work in 36 territories. As an individual, I have the responsibility to understand the processes through which I landed in this place, to learn about this place and how to be in good relations with indigenous peoples of this place. As an educator, these responsibilities translate into centering indigenous histories, knowledge, and stories in my teaching, and in educating non-indigenous students and colleagues on the history and present-day situations of indigenous peoples. This is what the TRC Call to Action 57 is. It called upon all of us to educate and learn the histories of indigenous peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, indigenous rights, treaties, indigenous law, but also on the relationship between indigenous peoples and Canadians. How do we learn and teach in ways that honor these indigenous histories, knowledge, and stories? How do we understand our position in the colonial present? How do we fight the lack of acknowledgement of the colonial histories of this country? This is not simply a matter of collective amnesia. This submission is a form of collective ignorance that has been aggressively produced and reproduced, effectively shaping how we relate to each other. This collective ignorance takes many forms. It takes the forms of denialism in residential schools. It takes the form of avoiding difficult conversations about colonialism. It takes the form of blaming the victims. But all of these forms indicate the particular way in which this collective ignorance is seen as absolutely normal rather than an anomaly. After all, being good relatives means knowing, learning, and acknowledging the character of our relationships in practice. Knowing, teaching, and learning requires some skills in intercultural competency, requires seeing indigenous peoples for all they are, have been, and were in the past, require an understanding of the human rights abuses that have been inflicted upon indigenous communities and individuals. And it also involves accepting that indigenous peoples have a lot to teach us. In the Americas, in the last 500 years, indigenous ways of knowing have been under attack. Indigenous knowledge have come to be seen as belonging to the past, as being frozen in time. Although there is no right way of conceiving time, Judeo-Christian's conception of time, which is conceived in terms of linear successions of events, has been secularized and universalized, shaping our view of time and of all other ideas of time, including cyclical, indigenous cyclical conceptions of time. Over time, we have come to see indigenous peoples as being in a different time, not in the modern world. According to Johannes Fabian, Ideas of the savage and the primitive, for example, are stereotypes that represent indigenous peoples as being outside the modern world and as being far from the modern speaking and writing subject. Ideas of indigenous peoples being on reserves and not in cities are also part of these stereotypical ideas. But if we pay close attention to these stereotypical ideas, we can see that these attributes are defined by time, by these linear conceptions of time, by an idea of progress and primitivism, where progress is equated to the Western world and primitive with indigenous peoples. The production and circulation of these ideas have created a form of collective ignorance that has erased colonialism from view. Many fail to comprehend colonialism as central to the history of this country. They think that colonialism and residential schools happened in a distant past, so distant that there is no point remembering. But if I ask you, what are your origin stories? How do they inform the way you see the world? I think some of you would actually have a hard time identifying these creation stories because we don't associate them with Western knowledge. But Western knowledge also has them. But they reveal a hierarchical view of the world, even though we often think that what we know and the way we know is the only valid knowledge, and that's from a Western perspective. But of course, knowledge is power. Making Western knowledge the only knowledge, the universal knowledge, has taken a lot of effort and violence. It required silencing and erasing other forms of knowledge. It involved disqualifying some people as holders of knowledge and reason. Saidiya Hartman argues that this silencing, the absence of some people's knowledge, as well as the desire to recuperate the presence of these knowledges, involves dealing with colonial violence. It's about listening for the unspoken words and stories, about translating misconstrued or forgotten words. It's also about reframing the disfigured lives with the intention of achieving a goal, a very difficult goal. We're addressing the violence that have created indigenous and Black peoples as lacking knowledge, as inhumans. Living on the land, indigenous women's understanding of place aim at doing a small part of this task, undoing some of this damage. Collectively, we wanted to demonstrate that indigenous peoples, and specifically indigenous women, are holders of important knowledge, that indigenous knowledge is not rigid and that it has been misconstrued, that in order for us to learn, interpret, and theorize this knowledge, we had to put back indigenous women in the landscape, on the land, and within a communal horizon of laws, principles, and relationships. We wanted to show that indigenous knowledge is not frozen in time, but alive. It has a spirit of its own. It is co-produced in relation to the land and the non-human world. Indigenous knowledge is embodied. I learn through and with my body, through experiencing the world, and by being in relation to the land, water, and all of the more than human. Knowledge is not separated from action, from what we do, from how we behave, and how we feel. Indigenous knowledge is also embedded in a conception of time that is cyclical, not linear. So history can and repeats itself. As I mentioned earlier, making Western knowledge and Euro-Canadian history, everybody's history, has required silencing indigenous knowledge and experiences. It has involved erasing indigenous women's experiences. Although interest in Indigenous knowledge has grown at both national and international levels, this knowledge is still seen as less than Western concepts and ways of knowing. While scientists and academics are increasingly interested in learning how Indigenous knowledge can be used to address climate change, they are still limited to seeing Indigenous knowledge for what it can do, as opposed to seeing it as a system of knowledge that is interrelated with land, kinship, governance, economy, and education, and more. Importantly, even though academics have observed that this knowledge is connected to how Indigenous peoples inhabit the world, they haven't devoted enough attention to Indigenous women's knowledge, experiences, and stories. In Indigenous societies, gender roles and responsibilities are delineated based on protocols shaping how communities organize socially. Moreover, the common preoccupation with the practical aspects of Indigenous knowledge has had the effect of separating the practices, the doing, from the communal, social, and cultural context in which they happened. Regardless of location and size, societies provide their members, men, women, two-spirit, trans, and queer individuals with a sense of being in the world and with pathways to achieve status and recognition. Men, women, and two-spirit individuals often had different responsibilities, use different spots and spaces and resources, and as such, they developed a specific knowledge. These differences not only derive from the specific activities and responsibilities, but also from the historical and contemporary social context in which their knowledge is produced, valued, and mobilized. Living on the land, Indigenous women's understanding of place, and I must say that we were not only thinking about women as a sex category or a gender category or based on reproductive capabilities, but more in terms of the roles that are performed in communities. This book makes the point that emphasizing Indigenous women's knowledge is important for several reasons. First, communities and individual experiences differ. Being an Indigenous woman, two-spirit, trans, or queer person is intertwined with lived experience and the worldview of a community. These ways of being and belonging come from the relationship to place, humans, and the non-human world. To ignore these differences is to undermine that people and all of these different groups of people are knowers and producers of knowledge, taking part in complex communal and social environmental processes. Second, from an Indigenous feminist perspective, it is important to understand and emphasize that place and communities are shaped by broader social relations. Intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, education shape people's lives and experiences. Third, lack of attention to this diverse knowledge means that often these groups of people, interests, and concerns are shoveled away. Unlike other studies, the contributors of Living on the Land wanted to ground Indigenous women's knowledge of land and place, both historically and at present. While mindful that many Indigenous peoples are no longer or directly connected to land, we wanted to demonstrate that despite colonial efforts to destroy this knowledge and this relationship, they have been retained and continue to be practiced and passed down across generations. At the same time, we wanted to document the unequal power relations that have limited and fragmented Indigenous women's relations to land and community. We show that power relations have rendered Indigenous women's knowledge and experiences invisible and politically irrelevant. At the same time, we wanted to highlight the visible and invisible ways in which Indigenous women have resisted. Numerous international conventions protect Indigenous knowledge. Members of the United Nations Panel on Traditional Knowledge have noted that Indigenous women can provide a unique and valuable perspective on the water crisis. The Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for instance, stresses the right of Indigenous peoples to control and maintain their social and cultural differences by living according to their own historically developed ways of life. In 2012, a United Nations resolution further recognized the value and the diversity of the cultures, Indigenous cultures, and the form of the social organization and their holistic traditional scientific knowledge. This increased attention to Indigenous knowledge have also raised concerns over the hierarchical relationship between Western and Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous scholars, some of whom have participated in this speaker series, have demonstrated that the conflicts between Indigenous knowledge holders and scientists result from the insistence of Western knowledge on categorizing and creating hierarchies, organizing and objectifying knowledge. For some, pursuing the integration of Indigenous knowledge into Western knowledge is only a convenient abstraction that separates bite-sized chunks of information that can be slotted into Western paradigms, completely fragmenting, decontextualizing, and distorting Indigenous knowledge. As Kahente Horn-Miller discussions of the Sky Woman's story in this book highlights, distortion has been central to the colonial project. As in Sky Woman's story, the distortion of Haudenosaunee matrilineal culture has taken place over centuries. This mother-centered culture, from which modern-day Haudenosaunee descent, is reflected in the story, which speaks to the power of women in their society. Kanien'kehá:ka women are recognized as the ones who bring life, as the ones who protect new life. Women's responsibilities work in counterbalance to that of men. However, through the effects of colonization, colonial policies, and patriarchy, women's abilities and responsibilities have been eroded and their identities and self-perception negated, disregarded, and reconstituted according to the imposed ideals of another people. Horn-Miller notes that distortion in the Indigenous world made people to fall out of balance with themselves and the world. Being in balance in all things is referred to as having a good mind. The social and political distortion of the role of Indigenous women started with earliest narrative written by Euro-American and Euro-Canadians about Indigenous peoples from a place of racism and patriarchy. Colonial policies were passed to undermine Indigenous women's influence and the threat it presented to the colonial project. They silenced and legislated away the presence of Indigenous women. They were erased from historical documents and their experiences ignored. Women became invisible, their knowledge non-existent. The contributors of Living on the Land, Indigenous women's understanding of place, show that this invisibility has been intentional and has had a great cost for Indigenous communities. It is an expression of the racialized gender power relations that have shaped Indigenous women, two-spirit bodies, families, and communities, as well as the social, political, historical, and material context in which they live. These racialized gender power relations continue to be reproduced despite Indigenous women's effort to document the relationship between large-scale resource development and their experiences of gender violence. This documentation continues to be ignored. Little attention is given to Indigenous women's knowledge and experiences of how natural resources can be better managed, or in land use studies, how can land use studies could actually produce better outcomes. Often, consideration of Indigenous knowledge focuses on men-dominated activities like hunting. Not that hunting is not important, but by paying attention only to hunting, a patriarchal archetype of man the hunter is reproduced, even though women hunt or are crucial to the success of hunting. Echoing Dubois' notions of double consciousness, another book contributor, Shailene Watuni-Joven, asks, what does it feel to be a problem? Feel like to be a problem? And we could add, what does it feel to be rendered invisible and irrelevant? The concept of double consciousness is connected to the devastating effects of being dehumanized. Dubois developed this concept within the temporal period of Black Americans living under the Jim Crow laws from 1890s to the 1910s. Black Americans were forced to segregate in schools, public places, transportation, and housing. Something similar happened in Canada as well. Dubois was concerned with the negative effect that dominant and legislated inferiority would have on the psyche of Black Americans. Jobin notes that for Dubois, double consciousness was like being born with a veil and gifted with a second sight of who we are. For Dubois, and I quote, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity," end of quote. One ever feels this two-ness, this double consciousness like distortion, makes people fall out of balance and on themselves. Jobin notes that Dubois was writing about double consciousness at a time when segregation and racism were a normative reality for Blacks and Indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States. Indigenous and Black peoples were both seen as problems. In Canada, there was a change from the Royal Proclamation of 1763, referring to Indigenous peoples as nations who retain the political authority over their lands, to a view where, according to Sir John A. Macdonald in the House of Commons in 1867, and I quote, "Indians were like children. They were like persons of their age, incapable of the management of their own affairs, and therefore the government had to assume the onerous duty of guardianship," end of quote. Through political and legal actions, the lives of Indigenous peoples changed forever. They were legally defined as inferior humans, as lacking. In Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Leanne Simpson writes, and I quote, "It is this shame of making Indigenous peoples inferior humans that is the basis of the humiliation that colonialism has heaped on our peoples for hundreds of years and is carried within our bodies, mind, and hearts. It is shame that our ancestors, our families and communities didn't fight hard enough against the colonial regime. To me, this colonial shame felt like not only a tremendous burden to carry, but it also felt displaced. We are not shameful people. We have not done nothing wrong. End of quote. Like distortion and double consciousness, shame takes hold when, as Indigenous people, we become disconnected from our stories, philosophies, and knowledge. Shame, as Simpson writes, becomes this insidious and infectious part of the cognitive imperialism that aims at convince us that we have been defeated and that there is no point in resisting. However, as Hornmiller and Jobin and all of the contributors of Living on the Land argue, healing, connection, and resistance are what have helped Indigenous people survive a process of catastrophic dimensions and in a context where they had few choices. Indigenous peoples have resisted by simply surviving, by being here despite all that has been used to intentionally destroy our communities and nations. Indigenous peoples, and particularly women, mothers, aunties, and sisters, trans and queer and two-spirit individuals have held communities together through acts of invisible and visible resistance. These acts include grandmothers retaining and passing down their knowledge, women working hard and creatively to feed their children in the face of oppression and induced poverty, women learning about their medicinal plants in the face of the absence of healthcare, women providing support to their own in the hostile environments of settler cities, women teaching beading, going berry picking, going fishing, as the contributors show, are ways of resisting distortion and shame and that idea of double consciousness. These were silent acts that didn't involve large-scale demonstrations, but that have been instrumental to Indigenous survival. Indigenous women also walk miles to protest living conditions on reserve. They have also organized protests to defend water and have organized against the colonial forces throughout Turtle Island. And we need to tell and retell these stories to shatter the collective colonial ignorance in Canada. We need to shatter the misconstrued ideas that non-Indigenous people might have about Indigenous peoples. Indigenous women have resisted by holding really tight onto their stories and knowledge, by keeping them alive, by whispering them to themselves and others, so that one day they could be told out loud. Like Hornmiller, Jobin, and others, in Dancing in Our Turtle's Back, sing some notes that reconnecting with our stories, that finding those stories of resistance and telling and retelling them so that our next generation know is a crucial task. And I would add that reconnecting with our stories and knowledge is essential for resisting at two sides of who we are, for resisting the distortion of ourselves and the shame that is not ours to carry. In Living on the Land, Jobin writes, for example, that despite the forced assimilation attempts of residential school, her grandmother hung onto her familiar teachings and also passed them on to the next generation, and the next generation onto the next generation. Her grandmother's stories have woven 5 generations of her family, passing down this knowledge from one to another. The passing down of oral history and knowledge speaks to acts of resistance to colonial assimilation, to the distortion of the Indigenous self. These stories and teachings stem from people's connections to land and the non-human world. This knowledge stems from our bodies being in place, being on land, and being in the land. These stories, like the Sky Woman's story, present us with a unique opportunity not only to resist, but to reimagine otherwise worlds and ways of being. These stories are theories of being, of our life in actual realities. They provide special insights into how an otherwise world is made of animals, humans, and spirit coexisting in mutual, affective, respectful, and reciprocal relations. Before we started this webinar, Ted and I were having this conversation about how elders have told him that these stories, the importance of telling these stories and the importance of thinking about the land, that our health, people's health, is a reflection of the health of the land. And we need to look back at these stories as a way to think about how to articulate our own theories and methods to fight colonialism, to fight what is happening to the land. Stories and storytelling are at their core survival. They are processes of putting back together where colonial forces have attempted to shatter. It is remembering and envisioning. Storytelling is an art, but also responsibility to uphold Indigenous worlds. Distortion, double consciousness, and shame can trap us individually and collectively to the point of paralyzing us. They can manifest in many insidious ways, including limiting our imagination. As Leanne Simpson argues, shakes make us unable to see the beautiful and the beauty of Indigenous stories and the beauty and importance of Indigenous knowledge, systems, and philosophies, but also the potential that they have, not just for Indigenous peoples, but actually for the world. I would add that these stories are what we need most in order to dream otherwise. Although Indigenous oral traditions and philosophies might be seen by some as removed from the world we currently live in, they hold information about processes that are still important today. But I actually think that if we think about these traditions and philosophies as being removed from the world we currently live in, actually that's already a limitation in our imagination, because we're already, the solutions that we can find to the issues, or the most important issues of our time, are limited, and we need to expand actually our horizon to find better and actual possible solutions. These stories, these traditions, these philosophies provide a means to document thousands of years of observation of specific places, of organizing politically, of living differently. Stories can teach us about the relationships our ancestors had with different entities, such as land and water in all of its forms. Stories can teach us that our obligation as humans is not to judge how entities, spirits, and supernatural forces may manifest at different times. Our task is to discern what these manifestations might indicate about the situation of our current existence. Reconnecting with our story means remembering our ways of being. It means revitalizing our political, philosophical, and intellectual traditions, our understandings of gender relations, and ways of inhabiting our world, our bodies. Reconnecting with our stories require us individuals and communities to interrogate the insidious work of conquest and colonization in every single aspect of our lives and in our relationships to each other. It requires us to reclaim the practices, knowledge, and life ways that best serve us today with the realities we confront today. Walking through the bush, through the cities, and through our communities is to walk through our stories, teaching, and experiences in order to interpret them within the horizon of our lives in practice. These stories are helpful for understanding that being Indigenous, an Indigenous woman, a trans, queer, or two-spirit person is grounded in ancient ways of being that are not hierarchical. These stories are helpful for envisioning ways of rebuilding Indigenous food systems and addressing some of the present issues of our time. As Zoe Todd documents in Living on the Land, Indigenous women's harvesting practices, their knowledge of the land, their relationship to fish, their relationship to medicinal plants, their relationship to berries, and many other things that exist in our specific territories are central to food security. Through fishing, and I would add, through other harvesting practices, women connect with the land and the memories that are inscribed in the landscape. Through those memories, through those practices, they reconfigure and reshape their relationship with other people and with the non-human world. Climate change is one of the central concerns of our time, and this knowledge could be vital to guide us to reimagine other ways of enacting reciprocal, effective, and responsible relationships with the non-human world. Ways of thinking outside of the box of property, of exploitation, of degradation that has brought us to where we are in the first place. Indigenous knowledge, stories, memories, experiences, and their potential to imagine other possibilities are threads that run through this entire collection. We begin with the creation story about how Turtle Island came to be. This story, like most Indigenous creation stories, is epic and is relational. It is useful for critiquing the colonial condition. Is crucial for thinking about the possibilities of reconnecting with other Indigenous nations. If our ancestors were able to think about Turtle Island, we have that knowledge to be able to reconnect with other nations as we used to do in the past. These and other stories hold clues about the experiences of regular communities, regular people, women, mothers, two-spirit and trans individuals, and men dreaming and embodying alternative visions. We inhabit, experience, and belong to the world, and as such, we constitute a multiplicity of knowledge holders. All of us collectively enrich what Indigenous knowledge is. We make it full. All of our pieces make it this complex, rich thing that is alive, that it moves, that has a spirit, that has ancestors. This diversity provides a wealth of teachings for contemporary Indigenous communities and for transitioning between a theory of being and life in actual practice. Chushkijeli. Chushkijelatu. Thank you for listening.
Oh, Dr. Isabel, those are the stories that you hold up in your book. They're of great beauty. I love to hear that voice that is so often ignored. We have a question from Sandra Selleck, one of our guests here in the audience. She says, what gives you hope that change is happening or will happen to recognize, seek, and honor the knowledge of Indigenous women?
Well, I think that Indigenous knowledge and stories give me a lot of hope. Give me a lot of hope in the sense that they tell of other possibilities. They tell that as humans, we have lived otherwise, that as human beings, we have been able to do things otherwise. And that, what more hope can I wait for than that those teachings are there, but that we also need to listen, that we also need to be open, that we also need to be aware that in order to learn, that in order to change, we need to expand our horizon for those stories, for that knowledge, for those experiences to have the right place in our lives, in our societies and communities.
I think that's good advice, just to be able to listen, right, intently and deeply. One of our previous guests talked about how deep that chasm is between Western knowledge and Western education systems and Western legislation, that seems to be sometimes an impenetrable wall between Indigenous knowledges and ways of being in their territories, and how imperative it was to have legislation in place to protect the Indigenous knowledge that's still there.
Yeah.
But he also talked about how hard that is, because oftentimes a Western world, as you said, will take that Indigenous knowledge and fit it into the categories that Western education has so strongly imprinted on our minds, to think that that's normal. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I think it is not just normal, right? Like it is also taken as something to be exploited, to be commodified. And in order for that knowledge to have the potential for changing, for transforming the ways we think about ourselves in society, and a lot of the problems that we confront as globally, we also need to bring another additional idea to this, and that's consent. That we need to recognize that Indigenous peoples are the ones that have produced this knowledge in relation to land, and that they must consent to this knowledge. They must be the ones telling these stories. They must be the ones saying what are the terms in which this knowledge can be used to solve some of these issues. So it's not about the Western system or scientists or academics leading the way, but actually to stepping back and allowing Indigenous peoples as holders of knowledge to actually do that work. We have done a lot already. So it's time for us to remind ourselves that we also have to learn, and we have to learn a lot. And to start, we have to unlearn all of what we have learned so far that have been actually help us a lot.
We have a friend of ours, Quisal Tanat. She's a teacher at Cedar Secondary, which is just up the road from where my office is right now. So she's watching this with some students. Is there anything that you would, given that opportunity to talk to high school students, any message that you would really like for them to hear?
Yeah, I would like to tell high school students, learn and think deeply about the fact that there are many different knowledge systems out there, and that the more we acknowledge that, the better we're going to be positioned to actually be able to relate differently to others, to the land, to our territories, and so on. I would encourage high school students to allow their minds to be open to absorb other ways of thinking that don't allow your mind to be closed up by institutions and knowledge systems that insist in you just being narrow. Look at the world in a more expansive way. That's what I would tell high school students.
That's amazing coming from a doctor in academia. So I love to hear that. Thank you for all of this. I'm going to turn it over to Zapotec to close our house. And my heart, yes, it's full today from all of your sharings and the women's stories that you hold up within your book as well. So
thank you so much for
seeing.
having me today. It was beautiful. Thank you again, Lawrence, for the beautiful song.
See him shwakwa nanu titamat anatana quail. Haichka thatakat upon I'll see him squallowan neat quam at a squallowan up people namet at an quail. Haichka thakat at an quiam tan squiam at an quail. Uth eat. Really acknowledging you, my dear relative, for laying down all of the goodness and the respectful way that you carry yourself in here and up here in your squallow, and laying down your teachings and sharing with us your stories and the wisdom that is very true. And I'm so grateful that my daughter was here with me to listen to everything you shared. And I was drawing parallels between everything that you were saying and how we live as Coast Salish people. And I could just listen to you talk forever. But I'm really grateful that you were able to join us. And on behalf of the school district, Vancouver Island Regional Libraries, and UBC Press, we are really raising our hands to you in a great show of respect from inside the core of our being for everything that you've shared with us today. And we look forward to hopefully sitting down with you again and partaking in the magic that you bring into the world. So, Aichka, CM, Aichka.
Chushkijelato.
Thanks for joining us today, everyone.
Thank you for having me.